everyone, welcome back. Expanding the Zone. I'm Shayne Combs here with my brother Matt Combs, and if you're watching us on the YouTube channel, thank you. Make sure you check out some of the recent things for our local listeners, really covering a lot of our local athletes. I know I've been even involved on some other things there with DB44 and getting the calls from SVC Network, and it's kept us busy. But Matt and I have certainly been working on this show now for a couple weeks, and we think we have a really good one. We're coming to you here on show 37, Expanding the Zone. And Matt, tonight we're going to talk about the ingredients needed to make great teams. And I'm sure this conversation is going to take us in a couple different directions. You know, we always have some sports things that are relevant that kind of maybe pique an interest or so forth. I know, just going back over recent sports big stories here, we've had the Ryder Cup into baseball season. I know we're into some playoff situations. Obviously, and we relate it to the high school game. You know, we're looking at some small school, big school things. We're going to talk a little bit of that. Probably going to take us down a road of expectations and so forth. I'm real excited to put some things together. Talk to us a little bit about the idea behind the show and how you might summarize tonight's show for us.
You know, I think you mentioned the Ryder Cup, Shane. For me, that's kind of the thing that sparked this in my mind a little bit in terms of, you know, what makes a great team. You know, when it comes to, as a coach or as a leader, putting your team together. It was interesting, you know, the American Ryder Cup team, when it was put together, there was some controversy, if you remember, at the beginning, because you know, there's like six automatic choices get put in, and then the captain is allowed to then select the other six guys, you know, and it depends who you listen to as to how that should go. I think there's actually a committee. It's not just the captain, but still, I mean, he's the one kind of making that call, or the face of the call, so to speak. And a lot of people think, you know, hey, you should just go off the rankings, right? I mean, take the next six best American players who are ranked, and you know, that's your team. Whereas he took a little bit of a different approach, and basically said, you know, he took a lot of those guys, but he skipped over, in particular, Patrick Reed, to take a couple guys that were ranked a little bit lower than him. And that was what kind of sparked a little bit of the controversy. And Patrick Reed's one of those guys, for people that maybe don't follow golf, is one of those guys that maybe isn't real well liked by everybody out there on the tour, and one of those guys that maybe some people wouldn't have really preferred to be teammates with, or might have messed with the team chemistry a little bit. And possibly, of course, he had some health problems. That could have been it too, you know, but the speculation was maybe that he was trying to put together, when I say Stricker, the captain, was trying to put together a team that involved having guys who, for the most part, you know, got along. There was a couple of the automatic selections that he couldn't do anything about, with the whole DeChambeau and Brooks Koepka deal. He kind of had to deal with that because those guys automatically qualified. But it was almost maybe that he didn't want to add another piece of bad chemistry, so to speak. And it got me thinking, Shane, like the whole question of, you know, the talent versus, you know, the chemistry. I mean, obviously you have to have talent. No, I mean, anybody who coaches that's any good at it will tell you that. You know, I don't care how good a coach you are, you have to have the talent. But when it's close, when you're dealing with guys who are equal talent or close to equal talent, how much is that? Do you give away a little bit for better chemistry? You know, what's your take on that whole? And does it matter what sport it's in? You know, some people will say golf's an individual sport. What's it matter if you and I hate each other's guts? Can't we go out there and play our round of golf and try to win? What's it matter if, you know what I mean? So does it matter more in some sports than others? I mean, I know I threw a couple of questions at you there, but what's your take on that?
Well, I think the biggest take is, you know, one of the first things that ended up coming to my mind is we were preparing for the show, and for whatever reason, without even really looking at my notes, just I had in my head as you were saying that, is I think back to the famous scene in, you know, Miracle, you know, the story of the Miracle on Ice, back to Herb Brooks and what was the assistant's name? Craig Patrick.
Yeah.
and I'm not much of a hockey guy, but I know Craig Patrick played, some NHL time there in the 70s or whatever, and he was selected as the assistant coach. And remember how they put together that big tryout thing, and they went, and Herb Brooks just went ahead and selected the team basically on the first day.
Right.
And Craig Patrick saying, hey, you're missing some of the best players. And he says, I'm not looking for the best players, Craig. I'm looking for the right ones. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about here is, as I think through sport to sport, certainly different, right? Some have a little bit more of an individual thing as you're touching on. Sometimes when even you put a team factor in, there's still a chemistry in terms of the morale of a team that can influence the way an individual performs and so forth. But let's not kid ourselves, in the flow of a basketball team or a volleyball team or a football team. There's some rhythm. Even in baseball, you could argue that it's an everyday grind. You spend a lot of time together. So I think there's a lot of chemistry issues there. So yeah, I think chemistry becomes a real big factor. And I think chemistry, Matt, can be a big factor because of the different expectations that follow teams at all levels, all the way up to professional sports, down to the college ranks, and even into our level at the high school. Let's face it, I think expectations that we put on ourselves, that the families have, that they want to see the program have, that the community has, and so forth. So I guess to see where you want me to go first, I guess I would ask you, what level did you want to start with? What topic do you want to start with in terms of, I would really like to take a look at this from different levels of sports, maybe even some different sports, kind of steer me in a direction where you want to go here first. And let's really break this down for the listeners.
Well, I mean, let's focus more on like the level we deal with. Okay. A high school level. Cause I think you and I've talked before in previous shows about how like, when it comes to chemistry and things like that and getting along with each other, maybe at the professional level when you guys are adults and they're getting paid to be professionals, maybe some of that can be overrated at times. I would still argue it's important, but maybe you can be a professional and overlook some things because that's just what you are at that age. Whereas when you're a teenager, it's hard to, you're not mature enough to look past that stuff. So if there's chemistry issues at the high school level, you understand what I'm saying? That probably shows up a little bit more. But let me ask you this question, like when it comes to sports too, because I think this is interesting. We like, for instance, basketball, okay, that I've always coached, and you've coached a lot of it too, obviously, and played it. We were always taught, and I think we understand now the importance of chemistry, right? But it's a sport where 5 players have to play sort of in sync. And so in other words, if my attitude's bad, it can affect the way you play because maybe I don't set a good screen. Maybe I don't get you the ball where you need to get it. Maybe I take bad shots, which hurts the team or whatever. Maybe I don't hustle back on defense. And football the same way, right? If 2 guys aren't blocking their assignments, the play blows up and it affects everybody. So in those sports, I think when you grow up playing those team sports, you value the chemistry and the camaraderie. But then you look at some of these individual sports, and I guess I'm asking you the question, what do you think it's as important? Do you think it's important at all? Take track. Does the guy that runs the 400 have to really like the guy that runs the mile? I mean, does it matter? I'll even take it a step further. You coach baseball, okay? Baseball is a team sport, no question about it, but it also has that individual component to it. Like, so in other words, if you had 6 all league caliber hitters in your lineup and 2 of them weren't very well liked, is it a big deal? I guess I'm just asking. They're still going to stand in there and take their 4 bats, and if the guys in the dugout don't really like them, they're gonna like the double in the gap anyway. You know what I mean? And driving and run. I guess, like, does chemistry matter? When that fly ball's hit the center field, it's just the center fielder catching it. Does chemistry matter in that situation? I guess you've coached both of those sports. I mean, you see what I'm saying? I've been an assistant at the baseball level, but you having ran your own program in both basketball and baseball, different types of sports, does chemistry matter equally at the high? Let's just worry about high school level here. Does it matter equally, or is it different? I mean, I don't know.
Matt, my take on this particular topic's always been pretty consistent throughout my career, and I probably, as I get older, feel even stronger about it. I feel the role chemistry plays is it's always going to dictate if a team's capable of reaching its full potential. You talked about talent. Let's not kid ourselves. Certainly, talent has a lot to do. You can have some great attitudes and you can really like one another. And if you can't catch up to a 78 to 80 mile per hour fastball, you're going to have a hard time competing in the SVC, right?
Right.
But what I'll say is this in terms of the chemistry factor. If you do not have a group that has a genuine love for one another and a genuine trust for one another, I have a hard time believing that group is going to be willing to take pitches, to lay a bunt down, to hit backside, to do some of those things that require you to go next level. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
Or in basketball, it takes a special type of attitude. Hey, I'll set these 6, 7, 8 screens to spring this guy open, even though he or she's probably going to get a little bit more of the headline. And at the same time, the person taking those shots, hey, I'll shoot on the nights I'm cold. I know my team believes in me, and I know they're not thinking I'm the ball hog and I'm this different. There's a trust factor there. Now, when you go into some of the individual things, like you were saying about track and golf, I think there's some truth to that. But again, I would argue that there's more of a genuine commitment, when you feel like you're a part of something bigger than yourself.
Right.
Going back to your Ryder Cup example, Tiger Woods, in the opinion of most people, best player of all time, certainly not outside the top 3 in the history of the entire game of golf.
Right.
Most people think he's number 1. Phil Mickelson, with what he's accomplished over the last 2 to 3 years, has probably put himself into that top 10 of all time. So are you better all of a sudden when those two are no longer on the Ryder Cup team? Well, some people say yes, as crazy as that sounds, because they talk about in a team situation that there's a little bit more of a team room that is a little bit more spread out. There's not the intimidation. It's not a situation of each member has a little bit more of an identity on the team. Now,
Right.
you may or may not agree with that, but again, I think anytime you're involved in a team or a group, even in my administration experience here, in terms of working with TBTs or BLTs or DLTs or different things, I would argue that anytime a talented individual takes his or her skills and joins a group, their ability to sacrifice, their ability to care about the opinions and care about the emotions and care about the attitude, care about the success. I know, Matt, you share this with me. Sometimes I'll watch game film, and my favorite part on a big time play will be the reaction of a teammate
Right.
or the reaction of the bench, right? It's that genuine, hey, I wasn't involved in this, but I had a chance to call one of the biggest upsets in SVC history here this past week. And one of the coolest moments at the end of the game was watching kids on the bench who didn't even get in the game.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? And their reaction. When I see that, I have a hard time believing that some chemistry doesn't matter, or that all parties involved caring does not matter. And I think that is the reason I feel like talent can certainly win. Don't get me wrong, talent's
Right.
a good thing. But the answer to your question in short would be, I do not feel like a team or a group can reach its full potential if they do not have some sort of chemistry and some sort of care for one another and an investment of seeing the entire process be successful.
Yeah, I agree with you. Obviously I was playing devil's advocate there a little bit, but at the same time, I do think sports are different for sure, and there's some different dynamics that go into it. But I guess at the high school level, especially, we're going to talk a little bit about development of that talent that you mentioned. We're going to talk about some of these expectations that I think you mentioned earlier already in this show. But I think for those things to happen too, there has to be some morale, a good feeling about what you're doing, right? And that kind of comes with that chemistry. I mean, let's face it, we're talking about what makes a good team, and obviously, there has to be an acceptable amount of talent, correct? But at the same time, sometimes that chemistry is the difference. If it were all about talent, then the most talented team would win the championship every year. And we see it in every single sport at every single level, right? I mean, how many times, I don't know how you would do a study on this. You'd have to look back. How many times did the most talented team win the championship in any sport at any level? It's just not an automatic thing. In fact, it's typically not the way it goes, right? It's somebody that maybe wasn't quite the most talented team, but put it together at the right time. And occasionally it's who you expect. It is the most talented team, but not always. So, you have to, with that being said, you have to think that chemistry plays a big role. I want to dive into something you had talked a little bit about. Um, the expectations. You had mentioned that earlier about expectations, and I'll let you kind of start off with that. But when you start talking about a great team, what comes to mind with the word expectations?
Well, I think with expectations, there it's okay to have lofty expectations, but they have to be fair and realistic expectations. And I think all parties involved have to be educated on what goes into setting those expectations. If if I were to use a higher level example, it might be, in a Major League Baseball, how might the Dodgers or the Yankees or the Red Sox, their management, their fan base, their media, how might they react, Matt, if they drop, 5 out of 6 in the middle of June compared to, like, we as Reds fans, or a Pirates organization, or a small, quote unquote, smaller market team, how they might, oftentimes is it in the small market, it's a rebuild and it's a process and it's all this. Whereas sometimes in those other markets, it's no, that's unacceptable. We're going to be better. And although there's some truth to that, I think what happens is the lack of expectation has no accountability to all people involved. So I think what happens is, what I'll share here, Matt, is, coaching at a small school, a lot of our local listeners will kind of know what I'm talking about. But basically what happened was, right around late 90s, early 2000s, there was a shift in enrollment that went in a crazy extreme in our league, and it was something that we had a hard time adapting to. And to be honest, we didn't adapt very well to it. And sometimes it can become an excuse. Sometimes it can be something that leads to a lot of frustration. It can lead to a lot of people not wanting to stay the course. I mean, like, sometimes it's hey, that's way too hard. I don't want to be a part of that. And it was something that we had to really restructure, and we had to go about the way we think. We had to start to have a different look in terms of little league sports and junior high sports and freshman and JV and so forth, and some of the difficulty of those. But then at the varsity level, understanding that, okay, our player development has to lead to an end result that can allow us to still be competitive. So before I go too much further in that, I guess that's where I'm coming from. I guess, do you see a factor in terms of the expectation, in terms of, oftentimes, be it a fan base, or maybe it's bosses in the workplace, the expectation and the accountability piece that's in play? Yes, it can lead to some pressure situations, but at the same time, don't you think it can be healthy if there's the right amount of balance that is pushing everybody to be as great as possible?
Yeah, you mentioned a couple things there. I mean, one, and I've said this before, I just don't think anything really, really outstanding happens without high expectations. I've always really believed that. I think it's very rare when something super happens and it just falls out of the sky and hits you in the head. I mean, typically there's expectations that sort of give you the vision, right, to get that whole thing started. And I think sometimes, you said that you have to be realistic. I think that's true, but at the same time, I think sometimes we can undershoot it too a little bit, or we can maybe even kind of cut ourselves short. Like you mentioned, as a at the major league level, for instance, in baseball, you'll hear the term small market. You hear it in all professional sports to an extent, but you hear it a lot in baseball, and it's always been a little bit of a pet peeve of mine because unfortunately, I was born into a Reds fandom. I always say I didn't choose it. I was sort of born into it, but and as a Reds fan, you hear this talk of small market, and I
Yeah.
really believe almost that it's an ownership's way of almost brainwashing a fan base sometime if you're not careful to use it as a crutch or an excuse, right? It's like I'll see people, it drives me nuts on social media. I'll see somebody say, well, the Reds can't afford to re-sign Nick Castellanos next year with what he'll be making. And I'm thinking, well, how do you know they can't afford it? Have you seen the books? I mean, did the Castellini family send you the ledger, let you leaf through it to see what their financial situation is? You've
Huh.
been told that they can't afford it. You've been
Right.
convinced to believe that now. So what's that do? It puts you in a small market mentality as a fan. The media, the media in Cincinnati's small market mentality. They're not as hard. You mentioned like the Dodgers or the Yankees. Why would things be said when they lose 6 of 7? Because the media would be saying, what's going on here? You guys have lost 6 or 7. Whereas in
Hmm.
the small market mentality, it's, well, just stay the course. It's a long season, those types of things. So I think it bleeds from ownership, uh, right on down to the fans. So you take that to the high school level if you're not careful, and you mentioned it. Let's say you're at a school that has some disadvantages. Let's say you're one of the smallest schools in the league. Let's say you don't have the financial resources, whatever the case may be. And all of a sudden, instead of figuring out ways to overcome that, right, you use it as an excuse or a crutch. Now, realistically, if you're the smallest school in the league, are you going to win the league in every sport every year? No, probably not. But but at the same time, you coach at, like you said, a small school. Do you approach your kids differently at the beginning of baseball season and say, "Hey guys, it's okay." You know what I mean? We've got a pretty good team here. We'll be in the Division 4 tournament. Let's just go through the motions over the next month and a half and play a few regular season games here and get ready for tournament. No, you approach it the same as you would if you coached at a school that had more enrollment or had more advantages, right? You don't use it as an excuse. So I think we have to be careful not to fall into that small market mentality where we find reasons where we're at a disadvantage and then we use those reasons as an excuse. I'm reminded of, and you know what I'm talking about here. I'm reminded of what our basketball coach in high school used to say, when you'd lose a game or whatever, there's plenty of excuses out there if you want to use them. Right. Yeah, we weren't, had a couple guys sick, had a guy injured, whatever. But it was his way of saying, are you going to be accountable or are you going to look for reasons to prop you up and give you an excuse to fail? So yeah, I think that for me, Shayne, um, those expectations, are crucial.
Well, I think you're spot on. I think what happens a lot of times is it's the expectations you put on yourself first.
Right.
I mean, it's when you're leading something or you're a part of something, there's a lot of adult implementation and some culture building that really needs to be present. I guess I would compare it, if we're going to continue to compare higher level sports, be it a general manager ownership, or if it's at the college level, a team of coaches that's doing recruiting, all the way down to the high school level. I think there's a sense of fundraising. There's a sense of facilities. I'll brag on Paint Valley here a second in terms of the one thing about Paint Valley is if you visit say Paint Valley on a football Friday night. I was calling a game last Friday night and someone asked me, about Paint Valley and some of their vision and so forth. And I was like, well, just look around this place. There's nothing small school about it. You see what I'm saying? In terms of our facilities and things that we're proud of there. That's just a small example of what you're talking about. I would say the other thing that's really important, Matt, and this is adult implementation, bleeding over into the kids, is player development.
Yeah.
You have to coach them all. It's one of those things where, if the big market team, they can probably miss on a free agent here and there, right? Because they can just cut their losses and go sign another one. Where I think what really makes small market elite, when you look at like what the Oakland A's were doing there for a while with the money ball and so forth, it's player development. It's a specific need and how you put the puzzle together. At the high school level, it's the day of individual workouts. You have to coach them all. There's no, you're not cutting very often, right? At the small school, you have to bring them all in and you got to get something out of every one of them. And, maybe it's a particular skill. It could be an attitude piece. It could be a teammate piece, whatever it is. There's a role for all of them to play. And you know what it's taught me here in probably the last 6 or 7 years? I've had kids that, as I've become more open-minded to this, I've had kids their freshman year, they'll walk into a basketball practice. I don't know a better way to say it, so I'll just be honest. They're almost in the way. You know what I'm saying? There's certain drills that are getting ready to take place where you're afraid they're going to get hurt.
Right.
And you'd be like, hey, you're going to have to maybe step to the side here and watch this or do this or whatever. I'm being dead serious here when I say I've had examples of that in their freshman year where 2 years later I've seen kids make the varsity team, or I've seen kids go on to even start on really good varsity team. I have one example where a young lady I coached here about 6-7 years ago, that was her as a freshman, and then her junior and senior year was a fifth starter, just kind of a tough-nosed defensive, hustle player on a team that won like 15, 16 games back-to-back years. So it's that player development where you can't give up on any of them. I know you have an example of in your high school days that we documented on that, the basketball, which is here on the YouTube channel. If people want to check that out, that was really one of the cool things we've done here on the channel. But a teammate of yours, Dan Cox, that you documented in there really well. So my point is the player development you can't afford to miss. You have to coach them all. Where a lot of times I think what happens in the big school or in that big market is you get someone that comes along and you don't like the way they do something, you can just send them packing on their way. We have to be a little bit more creative in discipline, a little bit more creative in player development. But again, those are just us recognizing what we have to do. And if you don't recognize, then it can really fall into that excuse category you were touching on a second ago.
Yeah, you said a couple things there, Shane, I want to unpack, but like the player development piece to me is maybe one of the ones that really gets overlooked the most, just because I feel like sometimes we just chalk things up to, well, they had more talent and so they automatically were better. And I think you have to ask yourself, okay, well, why do they have more talent? Now, in some cases, and you mentioned it, let's say you're at a really large high school, right? They're going to fight different battles than what we fight at schools, our size, because like you said, if you've got, I don't know, 1,000 kids in your school or whatever, then there's probably somebody else waiting waiting in line to take a position if somebody's not developing the right way. Whereas in situations like you're in, and you mentioned it at Paint Valley, take baseball, for instance, you guys have always had a really good baseball program there, but I look and I say, wow, you have your own little league program out there. So kids are playing at a young age and they're playing, basically for Paint Valley right out of the gate. Okay. And you've had great people, even with those facilities and batting cages and hitting facilities or whatever, to put the work in, money in, time in, to develop the program at that level. So then as they come up through the high school ranks, you further try to develop that talent. And like you said, there probably is more pressure on a coach in that situation because you can't miss on as many kids. You have to develop those kids because you're not in a situation where you have a huge enrollment. You're not in a situation where you're getting, 3 or 4 transfers a year because, like us at Benton County, you're in a location where you may not get those kids that maybe schools closer to a city would get in that setting, right? So you really have to develop your own. And I think that player development, Shayne, does 2 things, depending on the situation. And I want to get your take on this. If it's equal, let's just say 2 teams have equal resources, equal size, basically equal, equal type of kids they can draw from, I guess, or whatever. That player development ends up being the separating factor between 2 otherwise similar situations. You see what I'm saying? That player development piece is sort of the one that flips the scale, so to speak. Now, but what the situation though, where you're at a disadvantage, all right, you're in a league, let's say you're the smallest school in your league, and that player development then closes the gap. Do you understand what I'm saying? So if you kind of start equally, that player development could be the difference. And if you're starting at a disadvantage, that player development closes the gap to where all of a sudden now, like you said, you don't seem like the smallest school in the league anymore. You're right there. You're sticking your nose in. You're competing on a nightly basis. You see the 2 different situations there?
It makes total sense. And, I've been involved in this in leadership a little bit over the last month or 2. I had an interesting discussion with someone, I don't know, 2-3 weeks ago, where they were concerned about a direction of a program because they honestly were talking about, I just don't know where our talent's going to come from in 2026, 27, 28. And it caught me off guard a little bit. I'm thinking, hey, I'm trying to be good like next month. You know what I mean? Like it's
coming from about
one of those things where
about the 3rd grade there, okay?
Yeah, well, and that leads me right into the point. It's funny you say that, right? Because I know I sound sarcastic when I say this. I'm being as honest as ever. I've been doing this 20 plus years, and I'm getting ready to say an honest statement. When people say a 3rd grade group doesn't have any talent, or a 3rd grade group's really, really good, I don't even know what that means.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like, I honestly do not know what that means at that level, because when you watch the way kids change and so forth. So when we talked about expectations earlier, I was talking about educating people. And, what I was trying to explain to some of these people in some of these little league meetings and some of these junior high meetings I had was the fact that, look, these aren't excuses. These are knowledgeable expectations in terms of what we're trying to build to the end result, in terms of the high school level. If we're trying to play and we're trying to get 5 basketball players or 6 volleyball players or 9 baseball players or softball players in the 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, and it's grade versus grade, it's a tough thing to do. But if we trust the process and we're player developing, now all of a sudden that school that's much, much bigger, when we get to high school, no matter how many they have, Matt, they can only play 5 at a time on a basketball court. Right? They can only play 6 at a time.
You've closed the gap.
We can close the gap because we can develop 6 or 7 or 8. Now, they might develop 15, 20, and that might make their JV team a lot better than ours, but we can close the gap in terms of the product that we're trying to put on the court at the varsity level of these sports. And, yeah, I guess what I would go back to is, once you start to compete, see if you follow this. We have something in our baseball program called the Yankee rules. And basically what that refers to is we talk about controlling the controllables, things that we expect to be able to do no matter who we're playing. So I always talk about, even if we're playing the Yankees, if Aaron Judge is in the box, does that impact us throwing a first pitch strike? Now, he may hit it 500 feet, but is it a fair expectation for me to want my high school pitcher to throw a strike? Yeah, right. Yeah, it is. So like when you start losing the quote unquote bigger schools, you got to ask yourself, did we miss serves? Did we miss free throws? Did we not throw strikes? If we're playing a Division I baseball team at Paint Valley and we walked 7 guys and hit 3,
Right.
I don't know that that has anything to do with who we're playing. Does that make sense?
Right.
Benton County, which has been a really, really successful Division II program now for 20 years, if you're playing in Division I school and you lose by 8 and you are 18 of 41 from the free throw line, what's that have
Right.
to do with playing in Division I school? You see what I'm saying? So I think you have to have very clear expectations in terms of what it is you can control, what it is you want to be good at. You understand, there's nothing wrong with understanding and being educated at some of the deficits you have to make up. But when it comes to competing, at the end of the day, you still have to have an expectation of, I'm going to be successful. And maybe you won't be, right? But you have to have an expectation of, hey, our expectation is to be as good as that. And until the Cincinnati Reds develop that mentality, or until the small schools develop that mentality at the high school level, then you're going to fall short of some of that. And again, you're going to fall short of maybe maximizing your ultimate goal. It's just like the Reds this year. What were they, Matt? 83 and 77.
Right. 83 and 79. Yeah.
79. Sorry. Yeah. The not bad. I mean, I think that was their best record since 2013. I'm not saying it was a bad season, but what I am saying is over the last 2 months, that baseball team had an opportunity to swing 5 or 6 games the other way.
Right.
And it could have been a different story. I guess that's all I'm saying is it has to bother you when you do fall short of that. Even though it might be an uphill battle, it still has to bother you and bother the accountability partners involved to where you have a great desire to get back to work and try even harder the next time to close that gap. Does that kind of answer your question or follow where I'm going with that?
Well, there's no question. I mean, that player development piece and the expectations sort of walk hand in hand a little bit, I think, too, Shane. I mean, like, let me ask you this. Do you think that when a player doesn't develop, obviously, I think it's a little bit on that player. It's a little bit on his coaches. But do you think the whole coaching piece, since we talk a lot about coaching and leadership on this show, do you think coaches need to take a little more responsibility when players don't develop? Let me give you an example. I was listening to a podcast the other day. It's a college football podcast, and they were talking about USC. All right. And how far that program has fallen. I mean, it doesn't seem like that long ago. And I guess it's been a while now where Reggie Bush and Matt Leinart were there and they had every Hollywood star known to man standing on the sidelines during the game. And they're just running people off the field. Right. And when Pete Carroll was the coach and now all of a sudden the program, they've it's arguably a bottom half program of their conference. You know what I mean? They're not even really competitive right now. And they just fired their coach a couple games in or whatever. And, so it's like, what's happened to that program? And a lot of people will, anytime a college program struggles, right, people will point out recruiting. That comes back to what we talked about earlier, the talent level, right? Well, let's look at talent. Everybody wants to look at talent first. I get it. Okay, I do. It's important. And I've said before, in college sports, recruiting is the lifeblood of that program, so it's crucial. But what this guy was pointing out on that podcast was just a few years ago, 3-4 years ago, they had the number 4 recruiting class in the country. Before that, they've had a couple other top 10 recruiting classes in the country. So, where's that? What's happened to that talent? He compared it to Ohio State. I can't remember the exact years, but he took like a same 3-year stretch of recruiting classes, and on paper, ranking wise, they were similar recruiting classes. Okay, but yet, fast forward 3 or 4 years, 18 of those players for Ohio State were top 3-round draft picks in the NFL. They were drafted in the top 3 rounds, 18 of them at Ohio State, 4 from USC.
Oh, wow.
So you had similar recruiting classes, but yet 18 players at one school go to the NFL in the top 3 rounds and 4 in another. So this guy's argument was, what happened once they got to their campus? Who developed? Obviously, Ohio State players developed. These USC players didn't. Who does that fall on? And at that level, probably falls on the coaches, right? A lot, because they're with their players all the time. At the high school level, when you're only with your players from time to time, who has to bear the brunt of that responsibility? I mean, is it equal? Do coaches need to step up and say, yeah, it's my fault? I mean, let's face it, Shane, we've all had kids who, and I hate to admit it, but we've had kids who were just as good as sophomores as they were as seniors. And you're thinking, did I miss something here? What could I have done to help that kid more? Now, fortunately, we've had a lot of kids who have developed really, really well, but those ones that we miss on, like you said earlier, the ones that we quote unquote miss on, who's who's that fall on? Is that the coach? Is that the player? I mean, obviously it's probably a little bit of both, but what can we do at the high school level when you're only spending a couple hours a day with kids to increase that development?
Well, Matt, I know you and I do very little show prep, so I'm just going to share something here, and I'm going to ask you to tell me if this has been true in your career, because I don't know. I honestly don't know what your answer is. When I was younger, when you're a younger coach, you're trying so hard to belong, right? You're trying
Right.
so hard to dig in and run your program, or to be an assistant, or whatever your role is. And man, daggone it, you want to be a good coach, right? You want to get in there and say, hey, I'm knowledgeable and I work hard and I do this, and you want people to respect that program. As you get older, I think you have more of a I don't know, just a comfort level in terms of you're confident in what you do, you're confident in what you stand for, and some of those things start to go away a little bit more. So what I have found is, I get older, I feel 100% responsible for player development.
Right.
And it's one of those things, when I see a kid come through my program and he or she does not reach their full potential, that's something I completely look in the mirror on. Hey, was it something in motivation? Was it something in accountability? Did I not find did I not get the right drills or the right work? Did I not recognize the correct weaknesses to work on?
Right.
Did I not recognize the proper role? I mean, how many times do you see athletes go on teams, and maybe sometimes it's because of the team they play on and they just have to, but how many times you see kids asked to do things that they're not quite capable of doing, and you almost set them up to not be successful.
Right. You
So
put them in position to fail. Quite
that's
honestly,
right.
I mean, sometimes accidentally, or it's not like you want to, but just you do.
Or sometimes it's who you got, right? It's
Right.
if it's your best player, you may need them to be the point guard, right? I mean, if they're capable or not. But my point is, and I don't know if it's because I'm more comfortable in my own skin or whatever, and I feel comfortable to step out in front and shoulder that of, like, hey, I've got to be better there. I got to do better. Whereas when you're younger, maybe you feel you're setting yourself up for people not to respect you, or for people not to look at you as doing a good job. You follow what I'm saying? Have you found yourself later in your career just feeling a little bit stronger in your stance, or a little bit more comfortable in your job to be able to shoulder some of that responsibility and that blame?
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I mean, I'll say it's a little bit of a two-edged sword as you become an older coach, because I think to an extent, if you're not careful, that your comfort levels in some ways, I know it's not what you're talking about in this situation, but the fact that you become a little bit more comfortable can cause complacency. I've seen that with some people, and it's something I try to guard against, as I am, now, I guess, a veteran coach. But it's if you're not careful, you lose that urgency sometimes, because when you first started coaching, you were you had a sense of urgency in everything, right? I mean, to it, I mean, even to a degree where it
Oh,
was
you thought the
unhealthy.
travel call in the first quarter was going to decide the
Oh,
game? Yeah, I mean,
that's what I mean. I mean, you had a sense of urgency that was so off the charts that it was unhealthy. I mean, I laugh. I told somebody when I was a head coach, when I first started at Benton County, a couple years in, I'd have been 26, 27 years old. I can remember watching VHS tapes, right, of an opponent, getting ready to play an opponent. And then I would save all those VHS tapes, because I would also go back and watch a game of the officials we were getting ready to have the next night, how they called a game like 2 years ago, so I could see how to tell my guys, well, they'll let this go. That's how that's how obsessed I was with every single detail when I first started, because you
Right.
have this heightened sense of urgency, right? And but you also, what you're talking about, you have a heightened sense of defensiveness, because you don't want people to think you don't know what you're doing. You don't want to at times admit a mistake, because you don't know if admitting that mistake is going to be a show of a sign of weakness that could hurt you down the road. Whereas when you get older, you learn that there's nothing wrong with being vulnerable, right? There's nothing wrong with admitting, hey, I messed up here. I could have done more. And I think your players respect that. The people you work with respect that when you show that level of honesty. But so I do agree with that, Shayne. I think that as you get further into your career, you do, maybe you're a little harder on yourself in some ways, because
Well, I just look at it as accountable. Is that not fair?
yeah, I mean, it's probably fair. I mean, yeah, you don't, again, first of all, you probably don't make it late into your career with any level of success if you're used to making excuses. Okay.
Right.
So that level of accountability sort of builds anyways, because you learn over time, like, hey, I better not point the finger at anybody else. I got to handle my own business. Right. And so yeah, I think that does probably come into play. And it's like I've said this on this show before. I've used this example before in one of our other episodes of what Urban Meyer said years ago at Ohio State, where he told his staff, "Don't blame the players. Don't blame the players. These guys are all studs, or we wouldn't have recruited them." Okay,
Hmm.
if they're not getting it done, it's our fault for not teaching them the right way. And if we ever get to a point where they're not getting it 2, 3 years into this, okay, then maybe we have to admit that we recruited them and they weren't good enough to play at this level. Okay. But
Hmm.
until that point, we're going to blame ourselves for not teaching them correctly. So I think that's where that development piece comes in. I think the coaches have to take accountability on it.
Man, I'm gonna move into final thoughts here, and I'm
Yeah.
gonna, I'll go ahead and get started. I've been taking notes throughout tonight on the questions you asked, and I had a couple key things down I wanted to ask you. And I as I look through my notes here, I kind of summarize them into three particular things. And I guess even if I wanted to get fancy enough to make them start with the same letter, and I guess that doesn't matter, but like we're talking about educating ourselves. You're constantly wanting to educate yourself on the situation, on what you need to do to be successful. What is it you're trying to accomplish? And then that leads into the expectations, and expectations in terms of the difficulty that I have in my notes is oftentimes when you have a lot of different people coming at it from different perspectives, right? When you have coaches, administrators, parents, players, community members, fans, there's a lot of different dynamics there in terms of how they're going to want. But I think it's all healthy if everyone shares a common theme of wanting to be successful. It's kind of a checks and balances, so to speak. If I go back to using the the example from before, well, there's going to be a sense of urgency in New York because, as you said, the media and the fans and everybody involved is going to put the pressure. Therefore, the owner and the GM and the people responsible for making that product, and then the coaches and the players responsible for playing it out. That's why a Yankees third base coach in last night's game on one decision, they're saying that the third base coach should be fired. Like the headline today,
Right.
what they're talking about on talk shows, do you think he should lose his job? Because they got one
Right.
guy thrown out. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
That happens like once a series in some small markets, and you don't even know it happened. It's
Yeah.
my point is in terms of when it comes time to evaluate and having checks and balance, it has to be realistic. But at the same time, I don't mind a little bit on edge, because I do think it adds that sense of urgency that you're talking about of, hey, we're not going to accept not being great. I would almost rather have a little bit of the unfair expectation that pushes us ahead to be just a little bit better than we thought. If I were going to use an education example, you know, for the longest time in state testing, Matt, we just had achievement, right? And after a while, they started to figure out with, well, okay, there's achievement, but what about that in between? What if I start here and I'm supposed to get way up here? It seems all or nothing. So they started talking about added value and growth measures and different things. Well, hey, I didn't get all the way to my achievement goal, but I grew a little bit. And I guess that's what I'm talking about. Ultimately, aren't you wanting to maximize your potential and sometimes maybe even expect a little bit more of yourself? To me, that's what I get from this. I always look at this show here on Expanding the Zone as a little bit of professional development for us. You know, we hope to kind of stir interest and discussion for leaders and coaches and different people out there. But for me, I guess that's where I come from in terms of I never want to, the moment I stop driving to be successful, or that I want to see our staff or our students or our student athletes, the minute I stop wanting them to strive to be great, that's probably my cue to go ahead and get out of it, isn't it? I mean, that if I'm just being blunt.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. You know, it's almost like this discussion sort of inadvertently kind of came full circle if you think about it. We started by talking about the chemistry, right? We used the Ryder Cup example of, do you give away maybe a more talented player to bring in a more of a team guy? And how much does that chemistry matter? And then we got into talking about expectations and player development and having a sense of urgency. But if you think about it, Shayne, it comes back to the chemistry again, because it's so crucial, the makeup of your team. We talked about what makes a great team, right, at the beginning of this show. And if you look at the makeup of your team, if it's not made up of the right type of people, okay, if you don't have the right people, like you said, not the best players, right, like they said in the movie Miracle, the right players. If you don't have that right group, can you even have high expectations? Can you have good player development? Because what would happen in those situations is you would be so fractured, okay, that everybody would have different goals and expectations, right? Some people would want to work hard and develop. Some people be like, you used an education example. Now we've been in education now for quite a while, and we've all seen it. When chemistry is bad, let's say at a building level, okay, let's just take middle school, high school, whatever it is. You have bad chemistry, you have bad morale, let's say, right? The leaders, they don't develop good morale. What happens? Well, you have some teachers who still want to get the most out of their students. They're in there busting it every day, right? And you have some teachers that want to learn and become better at their craft. But then you'll have other teachers in that situation being like, this place sucks. I don't like working here. I just want my paycheck and go home, right? And you have all these different types of things going on, and there's no common goal. There's no driving force. And I think the same thing happens in teams. If we're going to have proper development, if we're going to have the expectations that we need to have to be successful, there has to be chemistry. There has to be a genuine togetherness, okay, for those things to happen. And yeah, can you get away with it at some levels and in some sports? Maybe to an extent, but I like what you said too. You're not really getting away with it because you're probably not reaching your full potential. Even if you have on paper what looks like a good season, like the Cincinnati Reds, right? You had a winning season for the first time in 9 years, 8 years, but did you have your best season? Did you reach the full potential? And if not, then one of these pieces we talked about tonight are missing. So it's something you could talk about on and on and on and on, obviously, but I do think it kind of comes full circle and comes back to that. What makes a great team is you better have the right players, not just the most talented ones. I think that's probably, for me, the thing that'll stick with me the most about the show tonight.
Hey, good stuff. Really enjoyed it. Again, this is show 37, Expanding the Zone. I want to give a shout out to Chris Good, Dr. Good there at Good Health Chiropractic Center. he has supported our website and now our some of our SVC Sports Talk Plus and what we're doing here on expanding the zone, and really appreciate that. He's done so much for student athletes. Make sure you're checking out the YouTube channel all the way back to, like Matt, we mentioned the Uniota basketball thing with basketball around the corner. That's a fun thing. We did some all access. I know Python's having an outstanding football season. We did an all access with them earlier in the year. That was really a cool piece. And then you'll get a lot of our student athletes being interviewed after some volleyball matches and so forth. So, well, Matt, on that note, we're going to get on out of here. Again, check us out on YouTube or on your podcast apps, wherever you get your podcasts. We're out there. Check us out. Look us up on social media. Facebook, Twitter, or you can always look for the SVC Sport Zone and you'll find us. But let us know what you think of the show. Let us know of future ideas. We have 2 or 3 that are coming up. We're real excited to go into some of the fall postseason stuff in high school, and then look ahead to basketball, some different topics that have been brought to our attention as well. So make sure you're checking out, subscribe to the YouTube channel so you never miss a show. Make sure you do the same on your podcast app, and we'll come at you again here real soon on Expanding the Zone. Thanks, everyone.